Are you ready, kids? I can't hear you. Who wants to learn about porifera cnidaria? I'm just kidding, that's pretty bad. I won't do that to you anymore than I've already done. All right, so yes, part 3, porifera and cnidaria. Cnidaria, you don't pronounce the C. Remember that. It was in the last part of your notes. And at the end of these notes, you're going to see a third addition to your field guide, okay? So let's go. Hopefully you did your bell work. And sponges. Sponges are in the phylum Porifera, meaning pore bearers. They have a whole bunch of holes in them that water goes in and out. I'll show you how exactly in a moment. They don't have any body symmetry, so they're shapeless. No, they have a shape, don't get me wrong. It's, we'll talk about symmetry on the next set right here, okay. But like bilateral symmetry, like both sides are the same or something like that, they don't have that. You can, if you cut them, no two sides will be alike. That's what symmetry means. Sessile means they're stuck in one place, they don't move. The opposite is motile. They have a very flexible skeleton. I think you've all felt a sponge before. And I don't mean like your kitchen sponge, your man-made cellulose sponge. I mean like the animal, the sponge, that's an animal. Very flexible. It's called spongin. It's a protein. It looks like this up close. Here are some highly varied sponge body types, and we're going to learn about all of them in this presentation. So you're going to have to draw some of these in your notes as you have empty boxes there. So in their flexible skeletons of spongin, they have these microscopic spicules, and they're either made out of glass, silicious, silicon dioxide, or calcareous, calcium carbonate, like shell material. So they're made out of one of those two things, and they come in different shapes. This is actual micrograph of spicules. And the reason that they have these in their soft spongin, because a lot of things eat sponges. Sponges have been around for hundreds of millions of years, before the dinosaurs were around. Some of the first animals to evolve. And so lots of things like to chomp away on sponges, but when they get a mouthful of spherasters, which literally means circle star, or ball star, calthrops, or Chinese, okay, when they get, they're gonna be like, I don't like the way this feels in my mouth. It's like eating glass or eating sand. I'm not gonna eat it, or I'm not gonna eat as much. So they'll take a bite and swim away, and they won't, or crawl away, and they won't eat the whole animal, right? Now, if you missed any of those, you'll have to come back and get them. Okay. Sponges are filter feeders. They don't have teeth to hunt their prey, but they do eat microscopic organisms, and how they do that is they use these flagellated cells called collar cells that make a current, and it pulls water in through the pores, and then the water, so while they're doing that, the amoebocytes pick up the particles of food and ingest them and use it for energy. And then the water gets filtered out through this opening at the top called an osculum. So there's lots of vocabulary here. Pretty straightforward, and of course this is an enlarged view of the cells. There would be many, many more in that organism. So a porocyte is the cells that make the opening. The collar cells have flagella that move. The food's picked up by the amoebocytes, and then again the water is sent out through the osculum. And so this is they put fluorescent dye on the outside of the sponge, and so you can see the flow of water as the fluorescent dye gets pulled into the porocytes by the collar cells. It comes out of the osculum and releases. So this is how you can visualize it. Okay, sponges can reproduce asexually by budding or sexually by producing gametes. So you can break a piece of this sponge off and lay it over there, and it would grow a whole new sponge. That's called budding. Or they will produce, or they'll spawn, which is releasing sperm and egg, because they're animals. Sponges are animals, very rudimentary animals, very primitive animals. But nonetheless, they produce sperm and egg, and they will release it, millions of them, out into the water, and then they'll meet, and then you'll get little sponge larvae that are planktonic, and eventually they'll be heavy enough to settle down on a substrate, a hard substrate, where they will grow. And SpongeBob doesn't like that very much. Okay. Kinds of sponges. We've got the encrusting sponge. So this is thin, brightly colored. They grow on rocks and dead corals. In other words, they're called encrusting because they form this crust-like cover over the top, but it's not really crusty like SpongeBob here. They're actually kind of soft. And when we look at the pilings, this is actually from one of the pilings under the Deerfield Beach camp during one of the years in the past. It's probably been grown over many, many times. But oftentimes they'll stop the camera on the piling, and you'll be able to see all sorts of invertebrate organisms, and some of them are sponges, encrusting sponges. Then there are sponges called glass sponges. So they're not glass like SpongeBob was looking through here. They're glass. They're made out of silicon dioxide. They have a lace-like skeleton of fused spicules. So this is a glass sponge that was found at very deep water, 1,500 feet. They are typically anchored in deep water sediments. And these are their skeletons. It's just amazing the patterns that these organisms take. It's almost, you can mathematically determine the repeating patterns. Like you know what a fractal is? If not, look it up. It's pretty cool. Cloud sponges, they look like a smoke or something like that, right? Clouds, it's a variety of glass sponge. They take many shapes, and they also like deep water. Common around 120 feet or deeper. So remember, these are animals. They're not plants. They don't need photosynthesis. They just filter their food from the water, particularly that marine snow that comes down, but also all the phytoplankton that die, or zooplankton. Boring sponges. So boring sponges will just do that. They will bore through calcium carbonate in shells and in corals, and they obtain nutrients that way, as well as to remain anchored, as well as filtering. So you see they all still have oscula. If you ever see a shell like this on the beach with a bunch of holes in it, and you wondered how did all those holes get there, it's because at one time this shell was covered in a boring sponge. Not a bored sponge. All right, then we've got sclerosponges, which are also called coralline sponges. So these sponges are called that because they have a calcium carbonate skeleton beneath their body of spongin. Okay? That should probably say spongin, I-N, at the end. They have siliceous spicules and spongin, and these are some of the first known fossils of animals. This type of sponges, sclerosponges. And this is mushroom-like ones that are in Palau in Micronesia. And if you remember that episode, Coral in a Can, Bath sponges. So these have no spicules, so you can use them to rub your body and you won't get all scratched up like sandpaper, because they're just soft. In Tarpon Springs in Florida, which is just north of Tampa, there are the Greek sponge docks. And you can see all the ships and you can buy sponges like this. There's probably places down here where you can buy sponges like this. They're soft, and people, you buy them to use them in the bathtub. It's kind of weird though, cleaning your body with a dead animal, I guess. Ignorance is bliss, I don't know. Now we're moving on from sponges to cnidarians. And even though that word is funny, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these organisms. For example, jellyfish and sea anemones, okay? So this is a whole different phylum. The first phylum we talked about today was porifera, sponges. This one is the cnidaria. And cnidarata, that means they have a body cavity, a coelom. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So they are, where the sponges had no symmetry, these guys have radial symmetry. Radial, like a radial tire, where you can cut it and every half will look the same. Or you can cut it in like parts and each pie piece will be similar. Okay, so radial, like a round symmetry. That's very important. You might have an FRQ on it. You might have to draw an organism with radial symmetry, and you have to know what that means. Repeating segments around a central axis. So Chironex fleckeri is the box jellyfish, or otherwise called a sea wasp. It can kill a person within minutes. Thank God we don't have those here, but Australia's got those box jellyfish. So we have to label this, I think, in your notes. They have an oral surface and an aboral surface, otherwise known as dorsal and ventral, okay? So the dorsal side, or the oral means mouth, right? So that's where the mouth is going to be. And the tentacles coming out like this, and then you've got the body, and then you've got the base, or the aboral. And they typically will stick onto a surface, but they can release themselves if they're unhappy with where they are. They can release themselves and they can't swim, they can't crawl, but they can fall to another part of where they live and attach again down to a lower region. But typically they stay in the same place all the time. Anemones. So cnidarians have two basic body forms. They have the polyp and the medusa form. So these guys, anemones, will at one time have a medusa form, and then when they're plankton, and then they will settle down and become the polyp form. And this is also the shape that corals take in. So corals are in this region. Jellyfish are like this their whole lives, except for some of them, which I want to show you. One of them is upside down. One of them sits on the bottom with the tentacles up. It's just amazing the variety of these organisms. So they have, like I said, a coelom or a gastrovascular cavity, and the mouth is always on the oral side or ventral side. So the polyp is the sac-like attached stage, and the medusa is the bell-like swimming stage. Polyp versus medusa. Medusa, it looks like, the Greek Medusa, Gorgon with the snake hair, okay, that if you look at her, you turn to stone. Who Perseus killed, he beheaded her. Mythology, it's fun. Okay, so tentacles. Tentacles are those slender, finger-like extensions used to capture food. And again, they have a gut, hence the name Cnidarian. A coelom is a body cavity in here. So an organism will come by, big or small, fish or even tinier, and they have stinging cells, which will paralyze the organism, and then the tentacle will bring the organism to the mouth, and the mouth will bring it down into the body cavity to digest. and their mouth is their anus. Yeah. So they have to make waste go out the same hole that food comes in. One hole. So again, we're talking about those stinging cells. Those are called nematocysts. Nematocysts are found on those tentacles. So here's a tentacle, you zoom in, here's a cell called a cnidocyte, actually. Cnidocyte. Cyte means cell. And it's loaded like one of those snake springs in a can that you pop, you know, oh, here, want some peanuts? And they'll pop it up and the snake jumps out. That's kind of what it is. So the prey will touch this trigger here, which opens up this door, and this coiled thread and the cnidocyte shoot out. And it will stab the prey, wrap up the prey, or tangle up the prey, or stick to the prey. Either way, there's 3 different kinds of nematocysts. So here they are. Sorry. Glutinant, glue, sticky. Volvent, it like involves the prey, wraps them up, it tangles them up. Okay. So this one's the sticky one. This one's the wrapped up one, and this one is the one you want to be careful of. This is the penetrant one. It's like a little harpoon with toxin, which makes the organism limp, okay? That's why you can get stung by corals. That's why you can get stung by jellyfish and anemones. They're owie, okay? And they've got toxin in them, and they go inside your skin, and yeah. All right, so here's real micrographs of cnidocysts on a tentacle, like it's a jellyfish tentacle. So these are the little stinging cells, all the things sticking out, and the little triggers there. Trigger it, and the cnidocyst gets discharged like a harpoon, just like this. Here's a drawing. So touch that, the operculum pops open, the coil shoots out. It's like a little harpoon barb, leaving the capsule empty. And then I'm assuming that cell will die and regenerate through mitosis. All right, some types of cnidaria are the hydrozoans. Class Hydrozoa, feathery or bushy colonies of tiny polyps. You will see these also on that piling, that close-up shot of the piling on the Deerfield Beach camera, which we're going to see more in the future in this class. So again, attached to pilings, shells, seaweeds, virtually every surface out there is covered by these guys. They have polyps that have special feeding for defense or for reproduction. Feeding, defense, or reproduction. So this is an anatomy of one, mouth, tentacles, just like an anemone. The gastrovascular cavity. They don't have a brain, but they have a nerve net so that they can react to the environment like any animal would. Epidermis, and so here's some colonies. Different polyps have different purposes along this whole growth. So here's one for reproducing. Here's some buds coming up. These will come off and form new ones. These are the ones for feeding. So, or defense. So here's a stinging hydrozoan in Borneo, in Malaysia. Looks like a pine tree needles, but it's an animal. And all of the tentacles, all of their little tentacles are out and ready for feeding. So as the current goes by, they pick up all that material, and little organisms, zooplankton and tiny little fish larvae and other things, and they just feed all day and night. So, okay, so a characteristic larva. There are larval forms here, and this is what's called a planula. So the characteristic larval form is a planula. It kind of looks like a jelly, this is a jellyfish with a planula inside, okay? And it's planktonic. So when it either comes out of the egg or whatever, or hatches or buds off, it'll eventually settle to the bottom and form a colony of polyps when it gets heavy enough that it's not plankton anymore. And so here's a coral planula ready to settle down. So, and then this is them, tiny ones that are settling down onto a surface. They get large enough that they can settle down, and then they start growing a colony, a whole colony of individual, so a whole head of coral is not one animal. Each of the little tiny polyps is an individual animal that lives in a colony. All right. Siphonophores are hydrozoans that form drifting colonies. And this is the Portuguese man of war, which I showed you before, a picture of one before, and they have so some of the polyps make the float, some of the polyps make reproductive organs, some of the polyps make the stinging cells for defense and for catching food. Okay? So if you look at this piece of coral here, okay, you can see the different tiny, where the polyps used to be. Each one of those holes is an individual animal that made a colony that secreted this skeleton, and they would grow on this skeleton. This was this is a piece of coral skeleton. So with many different animals living in a colony. Each of those holes was a polyp before it was killed in some way. Most likely some diver many, many years ago broke this off, because it's illegal to do that now, and dried it out in the sun and sold it somewhere. Used to be legal, but now obviously it's not. The Scyphozoans, these are large Medusa jellyfish common in all oceans. This is Rhizostoma pulmo, carries purple-blue pigment in its bell-fringed tentacles. And some of them can be huge, gigantic. Scyphozoans. Cassiopeia, the upside-down jellyfish, we have these right here in the Keys. I've seen these, many of them up close, snorkeling in the Keys. Is a genus of true jellyfish and the only members of this family, the Cassiopeia. So they pretty much are an upside-down jellyfish. They lay on the bottom with their bell down and their tentacles up to catch food. They sit in the mudflats, canals, turtle grass of Florida and the Caribbean. Cassiopeia. They're beautiful. Now we're going to move on to the Anthozoans. These are your sea anemones to start with. Okay. Solitary or colonial polyps that lack a medusa stage. Large muscular polyps, and they're larger in colder waters, like in the North Pacific, in California, Oregon, Washington. They're huge, meaty things. I think they're much more delicate here in Florida and the Caribbean and other parts of the world. And of course, the clownfish have a mucus coating that makes them not be affected by the stinging cells, the nematocysts. So they form a symbiotic relationship with the anemone. They use it as their home, and so it protects them from other fish eating them. Stony corals are members of this, wait, I went too far. Members of this family, okay? They are colonial polyps and they build reefs. Like I said, each one of these is an animal. Each one of those is an animal living in a colony together. And this is an up-close view of them. Two animals. Gorgonians are another one. Gorgonians are colonial, tough branching skeleton made of protein. Sea fans are an example. So like I said, each bump is another living animal, colonial. And you could see a sea fan right up there. That's a real one, dried out, of course, in the corner of the classroom over there. That's a gorgonian. Precious corals. These organisms are fused with red or pink calcareous spicules in addition to a protein skeleton. And unfortunately, they have been harvested to the detriment of everything that is in that ecosystem for making jewelry. They're considered a semi-precious stone, actually. So this is what they look like when they're alive. Each of the individual animals here, and they're growing this skeleton beneath them. Now there is a layer of tissue connecting the entire thing on the surface, a layer of tissue. And here's another one that's, I think, outside of the water, I don't know why. And this is what it looks like when it's cleaned up, and then it's a raw material that you can make jewelry from, which is a no-no. Same with black coral. Black coral is amazing. It looks like this when alive. And each of these are the different animals, okay? They're not gorgonians, nor are they stony coral. They're a unique kind of coral, secrete hard black protein skeleton that looks like this when harvested, not legal in many parts of the world because it's killing our world, okay? And this is the kind of jewelry that is made from that. Now, Mrs. Keene actually owns some coral jewelry, but it was from a different country, and she didn't buy it. Her mother owned it, or maybe it was her grandmother, from many years ago, from like 60 years ago. 60, 70 perhaps years ago is when it was obtained. So before the laws were put into place to protect it. She has some ivory too from that time period before the laws were put into place. Many of the laws started in the 60s and 70s when that whole Save the Earth environmentalism thing came about, which is a good thing. So the biology of cnidarians. They're carnivores. We know that they are animals, so they eat other animals, okay? They have an extracellular and intracellular digestion. So for example, well, there's an aquarium anemone eating a fish, but you could pretty much, for a sea anemone, you could put some food on the outside of its body and it could absorb the nutrients that way. That's the extracellular. Or they could ingest it into their body cavity, and that's intracellular digestion. So they don't have a brain, like I said before. They have specialized nerve cells. So you can see we're getting more advanced, right? So we went from the bacteria and the phytoplankton and the diatoms, right? And then the zooplankton. And then we moved up to the kelp and the seagrass and the mangroves. And now we're moving up to sponges, which don't have a neural net. But now these guys do. The cnidarians do. They have this neural net that serves as their brain, but it's like spread out throughout their entire body. But they don't have a brain, no brain. They have something called a statocyst, which is very similar to our cochlea, that snail-like looking organ in the inner ear. And they have these little tiny stones called statoliths that if you were to turn this organism sideways, like pull it off and turn it sideways, these would move. And they would tell the organism that, hey, you're not upright. You need to right yourself so that your tentacles can be free floating instead of stuck on the bottom. And so that's what they use the statocyst for. And they have these hair, little cilia in there that these rub on. Same thing with our inner ear. That's why when you're laying down, even if your eyes were closed, you would still know that you weren't upright. Coral reproduction. So they spawn, just like sponges, and they release gametes. So this is actually an egg and sperm coming out from one individual polyp, which is releasing it out, And here is a spawning event where they're all releasing at the same time into the water, because if they didn't release at the same time, then the sperm would get carried away, and then the next day the eggs would come out and the sperm would be gone. So they have to all release at the same time, and then the sperm and the egg, if by chance they meet up, they fertilize, and then they become the babies, which then settle down someplace else if they find a good place to settle down. Just like many organisms, these are called chancelings, so you're not going to get a lot of survivors. And that is sponges and cnidarians, porifera and cnidaria.